Well, we have an expert lineup of speakers ready to go. And so with that, I will turn things over to NBR's Vice President for Research, Ali Zawinski. Ali, over to you. Ali, can you hear me?
I think she can't hear you. That looked like what she was saying at the beginning.
Oh, looks like we might be having some audio problems for Ali. Ali, can you try speaking one more time?
All right, can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
All right, let's give this a try. All right, sorry for the technical difficulties, everybody. It's wonderful to have you all here. I'm really excited for this discussion here today. So today's conversation, the roundtable, we have the conversation we have here today with three wonderful experts builds on a roundtable of essays that was published in the most recent volume of Asia Policy, NBR's policy journal, that seeks to examine two trends: the movement toward minilateral groupings to achieve shared policy objectives among small state groups of states as one trend, and the second, the increased emphasis on strengthening deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, including through the Biden administration's concept of integrated deterrence. So the intersection of these two trends brings us to the topic of today's discussion, and that is, can these minilateral groupings deter? The series of essays in the most recent volume explore a range of connected themes to this question. They cover what some of the traditional deterrence theories tell us about the question, how they might need to be amended or updated to take into account some of the unique elements that minilateral groupings bring to these questions. And then they walk through a number of particular cases, including examinations of how minilaterals like the Quad intersect with these questions. So we have with us today the kind of editors and conveners of this roundtable of essays, and we're really looking forward to hearing some of their kind of key takeaways, the key points that they drew out of the essays and out of the examinations of these issues. And then we'll hear a little bit from a discussant who will maybe unpack some questions that come out of reading the roundtables and hearing remarks from our speakers. So to introduce all of those wonderful experts. First, we'll hear from Arzan and Brendan. Arzan Tarapur is a member of NBR's Board of Advisors, but in his day job is a research scholar on South Asia at the Walter Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. And then Brendan Taylor will also provide some remarks and is the Professor of Strategic Studies at the Strategic and Defense Studies Center at Australian National University. So after Arzan and Brendan have touched on a few themes, we'll turn it over to Jennifer Kavanaugh, who is a senior fellow in the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She spent her career studying national security threats and their consequences for U.S. foreign policy and defense strategy, and is currently working on a number of the issues that we're going to be discussing here today. So we're excited to get her thoughts and her questions about the issues that the panelists raise. So with that, I will turn it over to Arzan to kick us off.
Thanks, Ali. I think Brendan's actually going to go first. Over to you, Brendan.
Thanks so much, Arzan, and thanks everyone for joining us today. A very big thank you to Ali and to Audrey and the rest of the team at NBR, both for hosting this event and also for publishing the recent roundtable on the subject of minilateral deterrence in the Indo-Pacific in your wonderful journal, Asia Policy. Thank you also to the 6 wonderful contributors to that roundtable, Oriana Mastro, Eric Sayers, Kay Koga, Evan Laxmana, Kertian Zhang, and Tanvi Madan. It's genuinely been a privilege to work with those contributors and to appear in such illustrious company. We'd also like to thank Stanford University's Scott Sagan and La Trobe University's Rebecca Stratting, who served as discussants at the workshop back in February of this year, where the papers in this roundtable were initially developed and refined. Speaking of illustrious company, thanks so much to Jennifer Kavanagh from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace for doing us the honour of serving as our hopefully very critical expert discussion today. And last but not least, Arzen and I would like to thank the Australian Department of Defence for their generous funding of this project. And just on a personal note, I'd also like to say a big thank you to Arzen, who's been an absolute joy to collaborate with on this project. Depending upon what potential new research avenues emerge from today's event, I very much look forward to hopefully continuing to collaborate with Arzen, and maybe even some of you in the audience who might be interested in joining us in doing some further work in this area. When Arzen and I began thinking about this project and developing it, it struck us that as notable that very, very little, if anything, had thus far been written on the possible intersection between what we saw as 2 of the most important trends in contemporary Indo-Pacific security politics, the rise of minilateralism on the one hand, and the return to prominence of some of the more traditional strategic concepts, such as deterrence and coercion on the other. Now, there certainly is now a reasonably substantial and indeed a growing body of work on Indo-Pacific minilateralism in general, and as Ali has mentioned, on specific minilateral groupings such as the Quad. And while it is a smaller but nonetheless still growing body of work, which also makes use of long-standing strategic concepts to try to illuminate deepening strategic competition and rivalry in the Indo-Pacific. But perhaps what's even more interesting here is the extent to which strategic policy practitioners, especially in the US, in Australia, and Japan and India, are also reaching increasingly for these concepts, including in major speeches and in policy documents. As Ali has mentioned, for instance, the notion of integrated deterrence has become the centerpiece of the Biden administration's emerging defense strategy. As the project evolved, Arzen and I focused in on what we thought was, well, perhaps the most obvious, and we thought it was also probably the most policy relevant connection between these 2 major trends, and that in turn provided the focus for our Asia Policy Roundtable. That is, can minilateral groupings such as the Quad and AUKUS deter coercion and aggression in the Indo-Pacific, and if so, under what conditions? The first 2 essays in the roundtable, written by Oriana Mastro and Eric Sayers, address what might be termed the demand side of this question, identifying the essential requirements of contemporary deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. The second 2 essays, authored by Kay Koga and Evan Laxmana, adopt more of a regional focus and shift to the supply side of this question, considering the roles that minilaterals can play as security providers, including the types of political or military activities that these groupings might realistically perform. The final 2 essays in the collection by Kertian Zhang and Tanvi Madan then bring these 2 sides of the question, the demand side and the supply sides, together to offer differing perspectives on the Quad as a case study in Indo-Pacific minilateralism. Taken together, we think, or at least we hope, that the roundtable provides useful insights into both the potential for, but also the limitations to minilateral groupings as mechanisms for enhancing deterrence in the Indo-Pacific. Right from the outset, however, we always saw this project as being really only a first step to fill what we think remains quite a significant gap in the literature. And we do hope that the roundtable thus might serve as a basis for stimulating further research in this area. Indeed, more than anything, we'd generally like today's event to spark some promising new avenues and ideas for future such research. And we're certainly looking forward to hearing all of your comments, and particularly the comments from our expert discussion, Jennifer. On that note, I'll thank you once again for coming along today, and I'll hand over to Arzen to offer some additional introductory remarks.
Thank you so much, Brendan, as always, and repeatedly for the last couple of years, for all your work. Thanks to Ali and the whole NBR team for hosting this event, for publishing the roundtable, and of course to all our authors and discussants. As Brendan has very ably said, this whole thing was very much a team effort. Thanks in particular to the Australian Defence Department, I think, for seeing fit to sponsor this kind of research. It was important a couple of years ago when we first sketched out this idea, and I think it's only gotten more important since, right? We are in the midst of a high-intensity conventional conflict in Ukraine, which shows that these are very much globally live issues. We're in the midst of perennially rising, fluctuating tensions over Taiwan in our region. So these are definitely live issues. And as Ali and Brendan have both said, the US National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy both talk about integrated deterrence, and not just talk about integrated deterrence, but they also talk about the importance of allies and partners, specifically as one of the United States' great assets or strengths. And so it behooves us to see, okay, so if allies and partners are one of the great strengths of the collective like-minded group of countries in the region, then can they actually do the deterrence that they hope to do? Brendan's done a great job of introducing all the papers in the roundtable, and you out there in WebEx land can read them, and I encourage you to read them. They're all very readable and very short, but they all raise very sort of big issues in a very accessible way. But I want to help kick off the discussion today by taking a bit more of a critical look at our own work, right? I want to pose some critiques of our own work to hopefully spark a bit of discussion and give us some cues on where we can take it in the future. And one critique in particular is a critique essentially by comparison, right? Where some people, quite a few people, including people like Jeremy Maxey, who's very kindly delegated to me the ability to raise some of his ideas, is to compare the capacity of minilateral groupings like the Quad to deter aggression with the capacity of traditional coalitions, especially the US alliance system in the region, to do the same thing, to deter aggression, to keep the peace. The Quad in this critique essentially sits on top of, it supplements, it depends upon, it could not exist without the US alliance system. In fact, I mean, of course, I mean, this is a historical fact, right? The minilaterals exist in a world where the US alliance system already exists. And so the question then becomes, what more do these minilateral groupings like the Quad add that the US alliance system does not already provide when we talk about deterrence? I think to answer this critique, to flesh it out a little, it would be useful to, again, essentially address the two driving questions that structured our roundtable, our research on this, which is, first of all, what do states need to deter aggression and potential adversaries? How do you do deterrence? And secondly, does the Quad meet that need? Right? Again, this is, as Brendan put it, the demand and the supply side of this equation. So the first question: what do you need to do deterrence? And in the critique that I just flagged, the assumption is that in order to effectively deter aggression or a potential adversary, especially in a world where Ukraine has happened and where we see threats to Taiwan, that is a world of high-intensity conventional conflict, the question is, does deterrence require high-intensity conventional war-fighting capacity? Right? Now, clearly, among security analysts, there's a well-established trade-off, right, between the capabilities you need to deter and the capabilities you need to fight a war. There's obviously big overlaps, but there's also some trade-offs, right? When you forward deploy forces close to the potential adversary or the potential zone of conflict, you are more likely to deter that conflict, but at the same time, those forces become vulnerable in wartime. So there's a trade-off between the forces you use for deterrence and those for wartime, for warfighting. But I would argue, and I think some of the essays in our roundtable argue, that deterrence can also be political, right? And in particular, against an adversary like China, whose preference ordering suggests that its rise as a great power is its most important central driver of grand strategy. The threat of unified international action is probably at least as effective a deterrent against China as conventional warfighting capabilities. We've already seen hints and indications of that through crises in the South China Sea, through economic coercion of Australia. And so the question is, well, how, that is one potential counter, right? That political capabilities and political action may be at least as important as conventional military capabilities. Deterrence also comes in many different forms, right? Classically, we know about deterrence by punishment versus deterrence by denial, but one of our authors in this roundtable also raised the idea of deterrence by resilience, right? In which you can hopefully deter an adversary by making it clear that even if they win on the battlefield, their political gains are actually smaller than they expected. It's slightly different to deterrence by denial. But essentially, this means that deterrence is not just about, again, a head-to-head military contest. So the second question then is, can the Quad do these things? Can the Quad help us in achieving these forms of deterrence? Where and when can the Quad deter? And I think the consensus among our authors is that deterrence is not a binary condition. It doesn't either exist or not exist, right? It's a very highly contextualized and nuanced issue. Taiwan it is extremely hard to deter China from something that is so highly prized as Taiwan. It's a little bit less, perhaps, difficult to deter them in other territorial disputes that are less prized. It may be probably less difficult to deter them on more peripheral interests that are not about territorial integrity or the unity of the homeland. So the bottom line there is that Taiwan is not the only test. It is the hardest test of deterrence. Can we deter China from military operations against Taiwan? But it's not the only test by far. And I would suggest, again, going back to the idea of a unified international front being an important part of deterrence, the fact of the Quad itself, the fact that the Quad exists, is itself an important step in political deterrence. The Quad is a force in being. It exists, and it could get deeper. We've already seen it evolve quite radically in the last couple of years since the summits began, and that sends a signal that in fact Quad cooperation and Quad activities could in fact get more materially significant for China and could become therefore more have a greater deterrent impact, a greater coercive impact against China. The Quad is a chapeau also for bilateral or trilateral cooperation among Quad countries, right? So this very day, this very week, India and the US conducting their annual army exercises, UWS, which predate the Quad, but that's the type of bilateral or trilateral security cooperation that is now easier to deepen now that the Quad exists. And the Quad is a bit of a kernel for other non-Quad partners to plug into. We saw that with the COVID response, that this idea of a Quad plus is a potential organizing principle for regional countries to play a more central role in deterring aggression in the region. So to sum up, I would suggest that just as we see tactical trade-offs, right, in forward defense, the utility of a forward defense for deterrence as opposed to for warfighting, in the same way you see the same sort of trade-off at a strategic level as well. The more militarized a Quad gets, that may be useful for warfighting, but it also comes at a trade-off, a direct trade-off for the Quad's political acceptability and legitimacy around the region, and a region that shies away from overt signs of militarization and heightening competition. So that obviously then impacts the prospects for future collective action. So if our focus is only on high-end conventional warfighting, like in the Taiwan scenario, I would suggest we incur certain trade-offs and we cede the field for political influence, for the opportunity to build political influence and to drive strategic competition. So they're just a couple of ideas I would pose to begin this discussion on whether the Quad and minilaterals in general could deter. What do they deter, and how do they deter it? This is I hope, only the beginning of a longer-term discussion, and I am sure there are better, more considered, and more trenchant critiques to come, hopefully from Jennifer right now.
Well, thanks so much, Arzan and Brendan and Ali, for including me in this panel. When Ali emailed me, I had just recently actually come across the set of papers and read them, and so I was really excited to be asked because I found them to be very thought-provoking and just a really nice set of papers. So I feel really lucky to be here today. So I'm going to pick up, I think, a couple of the themes that both Brendan and Arzan brought up, but I think I'm going to take them maybe in a little bit of a different direction, although there's definitely some similarities. So, when I thought about this question of can or do minilaterals deter coercion and aggression in the Indo-Pacific, the answer I came away with after reading the papers was that yes, I think they do deter, and I think they do fill a gap that is left between these bilateral alliances that are already existing and multilateral frameworks. But I think that there are some caveats, and I think we need to think carefully about this question that Arzan raised, which is who are we deterring, and what are we deterring them from doing? Because not all minilaterals are intended to deter. Minilaterals can serve a whole range of different functions, and we shouldn't think that just because a minilateral isn't effective at deterrence, it's not useful in the theater. It could be serving some other sort of purpose. And so that's certainly something we want to keep in mind. And just by building a minilateral, we can't guarantee that it will have that deterrent effect. And I think sometimes in the U.S. discourse, there's this idea that if we build more coalitions and more alliances, that will naturally have this deterrent effect. And I don't think that's true. I think one of the benefits of minilaterals and the reason why it fits nicely in this space is that you can form something that's bigger than just two partners, but have a very narrow and specific focus and actually accomplish objectives that are difficult in a multilateral framework, or a framework where you only have two countries and you sort of have a much smaller impact. The set of papers and this question of who are we deterring and what are we deterring them from doing, I think cover a range of different answers to that question. In terms of who, there's obviously China. There's some talk of US interference or great power interference in sort of global commons type issues. And then there's non-state actors, pirates, terrorists, things like that. From doing what? I think this is really important because at least in the DC discourse, everything is China-Taiwan. That's like the main thing. But there's many things that we might want to deter China from doing. There's other types of territorial aggression. There's economic coercion. There's regional hegemony. There's deterring China from being able to set up its own world order or regional order and governance institutions, which is what Kay Koga brings up in that paper. In terms of there's great power interference, there's non-state actors. So there's a whole range of different things going on in these papers. And minilaterals, I think, operate on a spectrum in terms of how effective they are deterring these different things. We sell ourselves short if we only focus on those the deterring China from taking Taiwan, because that's a tough question. I don't think that minilaterals do that right now. I'm not sure they ever could, but that doesn't mean that they're not serving a purpose in the region. So I'll try to unpack that a little bit. This idea of deterrence also, it is fundamentally a whole of government concept. So when we think about deterring, we're not just thinking about security outcomes, we're also thinking about political and economic outcomes. This is what integrated deterrence tries to remind us of, although whether or not integrated deterrence is a new concept, we could debate that for this whole panel, but deterrence is fundamentally whole of government, and minilaterals can serve deterrent purposes even if they're not operating in the specific hard security domain, and they may be more effective in those areas. A third key caveat that we need to keep in mind is the gap between possibility and reality. And I think that Oriana Mastro's paper and Eric Sayer's paper bring this out well, thinking about what a minilateral could do, what partners could contribute versus what they actually are interested and willing to contribute. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. And when we evaluate minilaterals, we need to think carefully about what their intention is. The Quad may not be effective at deterring China from taking Taiwan. That doesn't mean it's a failure. Like it had a security focus, as Tanvi's paper points out, but it was never intended for that kind of high end. But I don't necessarily think that's the bar we should judge it on. So with those sorts of caveats about how we think about deterrence, what we're deterring, who we're deterring, I think that I came away with kind of 4 ways that minilaterals can contribute to deterrence in the theater. So I thought I'd just talk through what I see as those 4 ways and how minilaterals vary in their ability to deter along these kind of 4 lines, and then think a little bit about what changes that might help to improve their deterrent capability. So the first way in which minilaterals deter that I took away from these papers is by setting up regional governance. And this serves kind of 2 purposes. One is just to address common security concerns, so to deter non-state actors, to deal with things like piracy and terrorism. And so that is a deterrent function. We're not deterring China, but we're deterring somebody. And second, by filling vacuums. So if it's providing vaccines or helping to regulate common spacing or deal with phishing. If we have minilaterals, smaller countries coming together to solve these global governance challenges, then those aren't empty spaces for China or some other larger power to come in and sort of assert their preferences. And so it is a deterrent outcome. It's kind of deterring the ability of great powers, whether it's China or the US or whoever you're trying to deter, from coming in and developing sort of like a hegemonic infrastructure in the region. And I think that is a really important outcome. Evan Laxmana's essay, I think, offers a number of good examples of where this fits in. And I think the Quad executes this function very well in terms of thinking about digital connectivity, climate change. These are all areas where if the Quad is active and building this infrastructure, China or some other adversary is not. So the second, I think, way that minilaterals deter is through integration. And this is a little bit of a resilience argument. I think it's most relevant in the economic sphere. But if we have minilaterals that help smaller countries integrate, they may become less vulnerable to economic or some other type of coercion. This could be a supply chain argument. If we build our supply chains across a set of small countries, then we're no longer touching on China or some other source, or Russia or some other source that could be more easily disruptive. And so this, I think, has the effect of deterring that ability to coerce. And a lot of China's more aggressive and coercive actions in the region are not military. They're using their economic power to get their way. And so to the extent that more integrated infrastructure, whether it's economic or dealing with other types of humanitarian issues, it reduces the risk of that type of coercion. Evan's paper, I think, deals with this as well. He offers a number of different examples of minilaterals that I think fill this purpose. And this, I think, gets this idea that deterrence is fundamentally whole of government. It has to touch on these different aspects. So I think minilaterals perform pretty well on these first 2. On the next 2, which are getting more towards the hard security, I think there's more gaps. So I'm going to talk about both of them together and then talk about the shortcomings together because I think they go together. So the first is capability aggregation. If we get together, we have more military equipment, more strength to deal with threats. It's most commonly used in a military context, but you could imagine capability aggregation being relevant to economic or global governance as well. I think this is where you would see the Quad and AUKUS fitting in in their ability to aggregate capabilities. It doesn't just have to be like numbers of platforms. It could be like, AUKUS is a good example because you're combining like industrial and technological capability from the UK and the US and Australia's positioning and their relationships. And so that's like an aggregation of capabilities to help deal with these threats. I think Oriana Mastro's essay does a really great job of spelling out what capabilities could be available through the Quad for this type of purpose. Similarly, Eric Sayer's paper outlines a different approach, which would focus more on using partner capabilities and locations and US capabilities to kind of aggregate and build a more distributed force posture for the United States. Another option that doesn't come up in the papers that I think about a lot is defense industrial base cooperation. If we were able to build integrated defense industrial base, could we build up military capabilities internally rather than relying on sold weapons? And then the final one is burden sharing. And this is different than capability aggregation, I think, in that it's shifting activities that one country would do onto another country. So here I think Oriana's argument that we might be able to shift, have Australia and other countries take on activities that the US then wouldn't have to do, whether it's creating multiple dilemmas in a different part of the region or exerting a more competent economic, or not competent, convincing economic threat to China. That they're taking on tasks that then the US could focus its capabilities more narrowly on the Taiwan Strait or wherever the rest of the conflict was happening. Another thing that comes up a lot, you see this in the national security strategy, is getting Europe involved. I don't find that to be a very convincing argument, but having the UK and France play some kind of military role in the theater to help burden share. So on these last two types of deterrence, the last two ways that minilaterals can contribute to deterrence, it's not only relevant to challenges from China, it could be relevant to a whole range of different types of challenges. But I think that when we think about capability aggregation and burden sharing, we're most often thinking about China. But as Arzan pointed out, there's lots of different things that China might try to do in the theater where these types of deterrence might be relevant. And deterring China from taking Taiwan is the hardest case. But we might be able to deter, for example, limitations on freedom of navigation. So you could see the way in which some of the bi- and trilateral arrangements within the Quad could potentially have that purpose of making sure that waterways stay open. And there, I think you could be effective. But as you move up the chain to harder and harder and harder and harder security challenges, I think minilaterals, as currently construed, have limits. I don't think that it's a foregone conclusion that it'll always be that way, but for right now, they do. And I think that's for three reasons. The first is just willingness. Partners, even the ones that have capabilities, aren't all that interested in getting involved in a Taiwan scenario. So minilaterals aren't focused in that direction. Second, capabilities. I'm not convinced even in, I think Ariana and Eric do a great job of spelling out the ways in which we might be able to aggregate capabilities or burden share. I'm not convinced that it would be enough to actually change China's calculus. And finally, messaging, which Kirtian Zhang's essay brings up. If deterrence depends on perceptions, if China doesn't perceive that these alliances are geared towards and capable of complicating its ability to take Taiwan, then I don't think the minilateral will be able to have that impact. But all of those things are changeable over time. So I don't think that it's necessarily forever and ever, but I do see these limitations for right now. So, these four ways that minilaterals can deter and do deter regional governments in integration, capability aggregation, and burden sharing. I think that this minilateral format really facilitates these four types of deterrence in ways that bilateral and multilateral don't. And I think that they also balance between, Arzan mentioned this idea of building up warfighting capabilities. The other risk with that is that it causes escalation. So by building up so much warfighting capabilities, you actually trigger a war or trigger aggression. And I think that minilaterals occupy the space where you're less likely to hit that critical threshold. So what can we do to kind of maximize the value of deterrence and otherwise for minilaterals? I think the first that I took away from these papers is focus. The most effective multilaterals are focused on a narrow set of issues. They're tailored to that set of issues, and they're very effective at accomplishing those objectives. Once we start to shove in other issues, they start to get very diffuse. And that's one problem that I think the Quad faces is things keep getting added. And more things get added. The ability to deter along these specific lines of effort, I think, gets a little bit blurred. Second, making sure we focus on ties between partners. So, and not just like, the US in the center as the linchpin. So AUKUS, I think, suffers a little bit from this. It feels like it feels a little bit like a tripod, or like, yeah, a tripod. Missing one of the legs maybe, but anyway, it seems like a little unbalanced. The bi and trilateral relationships within the Quad, I think, are good in building that, but we do have to be careful that there aren't so many of them that they become conflicting and fragmenting, which would make actual collective action really difficult because you can't figure out who has a relationship with who for what purpose. Third, I think thinking about membership carefully. For example, for the Quad, would it be worth including Japan in a formal way? Was it necessary to cut France out? There's things that France might have been able to add. You don't want it to get too big, but do you have the right partners for the purpose? I think that's really what you need to be effective. And then finally, thinking about all of your minilaterals as a set. Like no one organization can deter along all these lines. We've talked about political, economic, governance, infrastructure building. No one minilateral can do all of it. So you want to make sure you're thinking about how they fit together to form this new architecture for, if we're moving from this bilateral, multilateral framework to something that is more minilateral, what does that architecture look like? And can we take a step back and think about the whole thing as a set? I think that'll be important going forward if this trend continues. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm looking forward to Arzan and Brendan's reactions and comments from you all.
So much, Jennifer. I do want us to give Arzan and Brendan now a chance to respond to some of those really excellent just overview of how you were reacting to some of the essays and really great questions and comments to pose. So whatever order, Arzan, you and Brendan want to go in there, welcome your feedback.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I've got. That was Jennifer. That was superb. Now you've made me think that we should have included like 2 or 3 essays from you as well in this roundtable. These are really, really good thoughts. I found myself agreeing with a lot of them. And let me just raise 3 points that your comments triggered as you were talking. Let me see if I can. I made very garbled notes, so let me see if I can make sense of them in no particular order. Let me begin actually with the very last point that you made, which is such an important point. This idea of considering all the minilaterals together as a constellation of minilaterals, right, as a new architecture for the region. I think this is critical because it gets to the motivation for the minilaterals to begin with, because I think what has given them such impulse in recent years, certainly from, for example, India, right, which is the country that I study most closely, the reason that India has become such an enthusiastic member of the Quad, which it previously was not, was obviously motivated by security concerns over China, but equally by a sense that the regional architecture that existed, which was centered around multilateral institutions, centered around ASEAN, and centered around the US hub and spoke alliance system, that architecture was no longer fit for purpose. And so what we now see in, it was either NSS or NDS, what Jake Sullivan calls the lattice work, right, of new partnerships and new groupings, these minilateral groupings. So I think this idea is critical because it gets to one of the key motivations for countries joining minilaterals, because they sense that there is a vacuum, as you started off by saying, in regional governance, and really their effect can only be seen in as a collective. So I think that's a critical point. So we in this roundtable focused heavily on the Quad, secondarily on AUKUS. Evan made a great contribution by reminding us that that minilaterals predate the Quad and in many different forms. But in fact, the fact is that they fill this need, and they only fill this need when there is a multiplicity of them and a complementarity of them. So that was critical. A second point that that was raised, that was triggered in me when you were talking. Another key benefit, I think, of minilaterals is that they allow for a more nuanced pursuit of strategic competition than alliances do. And you touched on this, you alluded to this a few times, the need to discriminate between, in our policy, the need in our assessments of the region, the need to discriminate between legitimate Chinese presence, influence, and activity in the region, and illicit or illegitimate or provocative activities. Too often, now there was an article recently about yesterday about how China is the only bipartisan issue in Washington anymore. The flip side of that is that anything that China is involved in is now considered to be illegitimate and a threat. In fact, when you take such an unsubtle, unnuanced perspective, not only is it sort of inherently wrong, but it's also self-injurious. It's damaging to our prospects in strategic competition, because parts of the region need China's economic relationships with China, and they fear conflict. And so this idea of a nuanced this idea of a blunt strategy that tries to oppose China everywhere it appears is injurious. So what minilaterals allow is a more nuanced strategic competition, because we can, especially if minilaterals are sort of bespoke for a particular purpose, as you were saying, we can pursue long-term goals of strategic competition without being so blunt in opposing Chinese influence everywhere. And the third point is about was the critical point about the US's role in minilaterals. The need, for example, as you mentioned, to encourage the thickening of the relationships, of the non-US relationships in minilaterals, I think is critical, especially because while some regional countries may, as you correctly pointed out, fear entanglement or entrapment in conflict that involves the US and China, for many other countries, I think there is a concern of abandonment or isolation, that the US, especially now that the region has seen how US domestic politics can affect US foreign policy, there is now a concern across the region, I would suggest, of the lack of a heightened concern, which has always been there, but now heightened, of US unreliability, that the US may abandon fledgling partners. And so one other benefit of minilaterals is that it helps to keep the US in, right? It's part of the old trope of the justification of NATO, right? It helped to keep the US in, and thickening regional architecture that involves the US provides more of that lattice work, reinforces the US commitment to the region when partners may be concerned about the lack of US commitment. So, Jennifer, that was sensational. Thank you so much. It triggered many chaotic thoughts in my mind, but all of them good and very, very useful. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jennifer. I couldn't agree more with Arzan. My reaction was almost identical in terms of when you were making those remarks. Is that why didn't we get you to do 2 or 3 essays for the collection? But I think your comments for me also, were very, very thought provoking, and I'll perhaps limit my thoughts to 3 points as well, just to give plenty of time for for others in the audience to ask questions. But I really liked your point, and it was a point I needed to hear about, that there was, there's many things that we might want to deter. I think as someone who works on, primarily on kind of Taiwan issues, cross-strait issues, I've found myself increasingly preoccupied on that. But even in that, in addition to the very important areas you mentioned, the other area that kind of struck me that perhaps we might want to focus a bit more that does fit into that conventional area is developments on the Korean Peninsula, and thinking back to the original minilateral, the trilateral coordination and oversight group that started up in the late 90s and early 2000s. While that relationship between Japan and South Korea still remains fraught, it does appear to have taken some steps forward, including as recently as this week in Bali with the first leaders summit in 3 years, and also the increased kind of trilateral cooperation with the US as well. So I think that's potentially another area that not falling into that trap of looking just at cross-strait issues. So thank you for reminding me of that, because I really needed to be reminded of that. The second point that you made that I was really interested in was the highlighting that gap that Oriana and Eric also talk about in their essays about the possibility and the reality. And one of the things that I was thinking about as you made those remarks is over time, depending upon the trajectory of rivalry between the US and China, but also others in the region, will that gap close, or will the gap kind of remain? Will those sorts of domestic political constraints, and not only in places like India, I think that's in other kind of issues of strategic culture. I mean, India is the most obvious one that we often talk about, and Arzan's far more expert on that than I am. But even in the Australian case, a very close and supportive US ally, I think that there are still constraints here politically that perhaps haven't come to the surface yet. And even in Japan, how far will Japan go? Will that gap close between the possibility and as the reality changes? If we do enter a period of even deeper strategic competition, will the possibilities change, or will those domestic factors continue to constrain and other factors of strategic culture? The other point I wanted to raise, and I think it's, once again, while I tried to pull myself away from the cross-strait stuff, I think I've also got a question for you about that, because I found your point about escalation dangers really fascinating, and I think it's Arzan and I were talking a bit about this in the aftermath of Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, and one of the things that we were talking about in terms of deterrence, rhetoric only takes you so far. At some point, you've actually got to do things on the ground to deter. But there is then the risk as you start doing more things on the ground, there is that risk of a spiral being created, or kind of tipping over, into actual use of military force. And I found your point really fascinating, that minilateralism or minilaterals are less prone to that risk, but by their very nature. And in some ways, the fact that they are a little bit looser and perhaps in some ways even a bit dysfunctional is potentially an advantage. But I'd be really interested in your thoughts on, is there another role for minilaterals, maybe the Quad or other other minilaterals in the Taiwan case that don't involve, I think you're right, that that kind of high level warfighting is probably just a too hard a case for the Quad. But are there other things that the Quad could usefully be doing vis-a-vis Taiwan that are perhaps lower and maybe less ambitious, but in the end more useful and more realistic? But thank you again, Jennifer. That was really a wonderful set of remarks, and thanks for all the work you've very evidently put into them as well. Really appreciate it.
Brendan and Arzan, and Brendan, your first point there was something I was kind of curious about as well. When we think about some of the non-China applications of do minilaterals deter, the other major aggressor in the region is North Korea, and it is one, as you noted, that there's a pre-existing minilateral that has had both formal and informal kind of structures to it over time. And so how does that factor into some of the findings from your essays? Does it kind of validate some of the key components, the strengths of minilaterals to deter? Or are there elements of it that make us kind of reconsider if it's a different type of actor? North Korea is a very different type of actor than China. And the structure that the US, ROK, and Japan have taken, it's not, there are other states that have also participated in different forms of minilaterals and attempting to coerce North Korea. So, I would be interested in hearing your thoughts, and maybe that's your future area of study to kind of factor the North Korea question in, but especially with the broader Indo-Pacific context, that seems to be a piece that could really have further analysis. We do have a number of questions. If you guys have any responses to that, I'm glad for you to take those first. But we have a few questions that are focused on specifically some of the questions on minilaterals and their objectives in the region that we can turn to. Okay. So our first question is kind of a little bit of a two-parter, which the audience member notes that AUKUS and the Quad both have, those minilaterals have only one country on the Asian continent, namely India, which shares a border with China, and that being only on India's east and on China's west. So why do the groupings that we're kind of discussing here not include historic US military allies on the Asian mainland, specifically South Korea? And so kind of fits together with a kind of follow-on question about what is missing here that discourages the US from creating a discrete grouping that also includes an ally like Korea. So there's some political considerations there, but is there anything else from the study that you could speak to?
I'm happy to jump in and have first go, and if you like, a really good question. And it's interesting, I think, when you look back at the history of minilateralism and the history of the Quad, that in the early 2000s there was an attempt to one of the very first kind of proposals to establish an Asian Quad. In fact, didn't include India. It was for a kind of a grouping of the US and its three key Asian allies, Japan and Australia and South Korea. But I think that initially that idea wasn't taken up, I think, because at the time it was in a very different context, and there were concerns that it would be, too provocative to China. I think even Australia, where I think the debate here has shifted. I think even Australia at that time was concerned that it would be too provocative to China. I think that remains the case up to a point in South Korea. I think that South Korea, perhaps unlike Japan and even Australia, amongst the kind of the closest of the Asian allies, I think has continued to, notwithstanding the shift to a conservative government in Korea, the Yoon government, and also some of the difficulties that the South Koreans have experienced, particularly following the deployment of THAAD in South Korea, and the economic coercion that South Korea was subjected to in the wake of that. I think South Korea has continued to largely hedge between the US and China. Part of the reason for that is because of the North Korean issue, and the perception that in the end, because of the large extent to which China supplies most of North Korea's food and fuel, the South Koreans really see China as being central to the management of that North Korean threat. So they don't want to get offside completely with the Chinese. I think historically the very troubled relationship with Japan has also been an inhibiting factor as well. So I think that's the idea of an Asian Quad involving South Korea is certainly one that's been floated before, but I think those are the reasons why it hasn't eventuated, and I mean, never say never, I suppose, but I think it'd be harder to bring the South Koreans on board in anything beyond a kind of a Quad plus. That does, I think, create some potential challenges, particularly for a country like Australia. There's traditionally been a tension in our own strategic policy about whether we'd find our security with the Asian region or against the Asian region. I think one could argue that while the new Albanese government has tried to deepen ties with Southeast Asia and build upon the previous Morrison government's linkages with the Southwest Pacific and is placing a heavy emphasis on those two sub-regions, I think by and large, as a result of the Quad, but particularly as a result of AUKUS, I think one could say that in terms of that historic tension, Australia is continuing to look for its security against Asia rather than with Asia.
My response to this, very good question, which gets to the issue of the issue that we used to hear a lot about, which is, will the Quad expand? Will there be a Quad plus? Why does it not involve other countries? Well, I think I'm going to steal basically my ideas from Jennifer, which are, first of all, that if such an arrangement was to happen, there would have to be an alignment of purpose and priorities, right? The purpose of the minilateral, as Jennifer said, that they often are designed to address a particular strategic purpose, and the priorities of the country involved. And it may be that particular countries have bigger fish to fry, more urgent threats to consider than what the Quad is designed to do, which, again, borrowing from Jennifer, is very much about sort of providing this lattice work of regional order and governance to the region. And again, stealing from Jennifer, there is a sweet spot, right, for minilaterals, a sweet spot of membership. You want enough so that it is effective and not so many that it is ineffective. And as Brendan said, there was a time when Australia was considered to be an unreliable member, at least in the eyes of some in the region, like in India. And so you need to strike that balance between having all the pieces that are necessary, but none that are that might induce some drag on a group. Having said all of that, I think Korea is one of the countries that is most often cited as a candidate for a Quad plus, depending on what the purpose of that Quad plus arrangement would be.
So I would just say that I agree with Arzan's agreement of with my points, but I would say I think it is important to get South Korea more involved in some of these minilaterals, but the Quad may not be the right vehicle. Like, the right way, in my mind, to build a minilateral that includes Korea would be to find an area where Korea's interests align with the interests of, say, Australia and India and Japan and some other country, and form the minilateral around that set of interests for that specific purpose. We in the U.S. we're very used to building institutions, whether it's the UN, a big thing, or a small thing, and then we build it around what we think it should be around, and then we get everyone else, and we try to get people to join it. But to me, that's the wrong way. The right way is to figure out what people are doing already, and then latch onto that, because that's going to then keep them inside, because you're doing something that they already want. They already have aligned interests. You're not going to have to deal with cheating or people trying to, game the system, or people working against the consensus. And so, to me, that idea of finding these centers of gravity and building networks and institutions around those, that is, to me, a much more effective way to go about this. And that would be the way I would see to get South Korea more integrated, which I think is an important thing to do. It just may not be that the Quad is the right vehicle.
And I think actually there are a few, it depends on how we define minilaterals, right? And there's actually a question in the chat about that I think gets at this as well. But there's the Mineral Security Partnership that South Korea is a part of is one example that might be, it's early days still, but South Korea is fully engaged and involved in, and it's very issue specific. It's something that South Korea can really get on board with, along with a number of US and other like-minded partners in the region, to address an issue around critical minerals that will hopefully get South Korea kind of participating in other ways as well. So I think that's a really great way bring it in.
Yeah, South Korea also is really interested in expanding its arms sales. That's been really active in trying to sell arms to other countries. So that's another area. Like, there's lots of countries in the region that want to build their defense capabilities. And right now they're dependent mostly on sales from either, Russia, which the US would prefer they didn't buy weapons from, or the United States. The United States already faces stress on its defense industrial base, trying to supply Ukraine and Taiwan and itself. So trying to think about how we build like defense industrial base ties, South Korea would be a natural partner, and that would be something they'd be probably very interested in.
You may have previewed the other question earlier in the chat, which touches on the Russian arms sales question, which was the importance of interoperability and / joint exercises and training. This person asked in the chat that this mentioned that they were told recently by a well-placed Indian scholar that India still depends on Russia for 60% of its military equipment. So can minilateralism, can India's involvement in other minilateral groupings give it an opportunity to diversify and presumably diversify towards military equipment that is more interoperable with some of these other partners?
Look, from my perspective, that's right. It's at least 60%. It depends on how you count it. Some estimates say 60, some estimates say as high as 80. Depends on how you count it. But yes, I mean it is an issue not only from the perspective of Washington, but also from the perspective of Delhi, right? Because the whole purpose of Indian foreign policy over many decades has been to avoid overdependence on any one country. And clearly, India does have extreme dependence on this one particular country. And I think there is a recognition in New Delhi that it, for its own reasons, Ukraine or not, has a strong interest in reducing its dependence on Russia. The way that India seeks to do that, I should say, is not by necessarily, is not ideally by diversifying foreign sources of arms, but to actually build its indigenous capacity to manufacture its own weaponry. Obviously, that's a longer-term goal, and in the short to medium term, there's going to be some reliance, and the way to reduce dependence on Russia or any other country is to diversify. Now, do minilaterals do that? Not specifically, because there's no minilateral consortium that is designed to build and provide arms. But minilaterals do provide the sort of, as I called it, or as other people have called it, the chapeau, the sort of framework of a political alignment of and an arms relationship may be part of that political relationship. So in a very indirect way, minilaterals may help with that. But I think that would be still seen as a waypoint, as a short-term and suboptimal solution, because the ultimate goal for India is to build up its indigenous capacity.
So you could imagine, though, a network sort of like the way the US has managed the F-35 program, which is to have like production spread across multiple countries. And that serves many purposes. It spreads out it allows you to focus on comparative advantages. It builds network ties and interoperability. So it has lots of advantages. You could imagine doing something maybe not with the F-35, because obviously the technology is very sensitive, but you could imagine the US using co-production in that way to help build up the industrial capabilities of countries like India that does want their own indigenous capabilities. And that could serve kind of a dual purpose of, as the question suggests, building, diversifying suppliers of weapons, but also serving what Arzan noted as the really important purpose of building their own capabilities. So I know there's resistance within DoD to going too far down the co-production line, especially with sensitive technologies. But from my view, if we're really serious about increasing deterrence in the theater, it's really the only way that we can service the needs of all the demands on the U.S. industrial base. It's really the only way we can address it, or the U.S. can address it.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think large parts of the U.S., not just the Pentagon, but large parts of the U.S. national security apparatus, including defense industry, recognizes this, and so most of the most enticing or at least the highest priority proposals for what the US wants to sell India all involve a component of co-production, if not moving entire assembly lines to India. This is part of that friend-shoring idea that we now talk about.
I have several other questions that have come in. This has definitely been a lively discussion that's generated a lot of interest. But I'm going to try to keep us to time. So I'll throw maybe 2 other questions out there and you guys can address them in whatever order or whichever one you want to cherry pick. So the first is, how can the Quad reassure ASEAN that it respects ASEAN centrality and is not there to overshadow ASEAN's existing frameworks? So that's the first question. And then the second is, for the quadrilateral security dialogue, minilateralism usually relies on informality, which can function as a double-edged sword, which I think some of the essays do touch upon. It poses some challenges to achieve the regional security through the framework of minilateralism. So how can the United States and perhaps maybe some of the other Quad partners cope with the challenges that originate from the informality of these structures? So let's see if we can get comments on either one or both of these questions from each of you before we wrap up. Brendan, you were the next up, I guess, to speak, so I'll turn to you first.
Thanks, Ellie. Both really good questions. I might try and have a try at the first one about how can the Quad reassure ASEAN, because I think that's a really difficult one, and I think that there are efforts being made. I think you'll see, including as recently as this week, President Biden trying to reassure ASEAN that it was that ASEAN is at the center of his and the US vision for the Indo-Pacific. Australia's even the previous Australian government, and certainly the current Australian government, has been trying to reiterate this message as well. But I think, in all honesty, saying it is one thing, but I think it's I'm not sure that many of the governments in Southeast Asia really buy this rhetoric, and I think part of the problem relates to the fact that in the end, institutions do play a role in kind of building order and creating order, but in the end, and maybe this is my inner realist coming out, but in the end, I think institutions more often than not reflect order rather than creating order. And I think what we're seeing, if we look at the kind of the bigger picture of the region at the moment, is really 3 different competing visions for order. And I think the free and open Indo-Pacific, that countries like the US and Japan and Australia in particular have been behind as kind of one of those visions for really a continuation of the US-led order that we've all benefit from. I think there's obviously an attempt on China's part to push the US out and to have a Chinese-centered order. And then I think ASEAN has been a bit later to this to this party, but they did have come out with their own kind of Indo-Pacific outlook that I think places a much heavier emphasis on institutions and trying to preserve and regenerate those kind of multilateral institutions where ASEAN is at the center of those and is in the driver's seat and making those kind of the foundations or the for regional order. And I think in the end, my perhaps overly cynical view is what's happening in the region is we have basically a competition between those 3 competing visions, and so beyond the rhetoric of telling ASEAN, trying to reassure ASEAN that they are at the center of the kind of the free and open Indo-Pacific. There's certainly an important Southeast Asian countries that are very important players in that, but I think in terms of ASEAN's ASEAN's role, I think it's going to be very hard to convince them, because I think in the end, the free and open Indo-Pacific, from my perspective anyway, is really more of a power balancing strategy.
To retain the order of speaking, I'll have a crack at the second question to complement what Brendan said regarding the informality of the Quad and to what extent and how we can overcome that. I would suggest that, in fact, as the questioner mentioned, it can actually be a strength, right? As some of our essays suggested. In the Quad in particular, I would suggest that the most certainly the most military cooperation activities that the Quad undertakes are undertaken not under the banner of the official Quad. They are activities that do not come out of summit meetings or foreign ministers' meetings. They come out of the 4 countries getting together and doing things like Malabar, just underway recently, which are not officially part of the Quad, but they involve the 4 Quad countries and no other countries, right? So they're part. So I would suggest that the Quad deliberately makes use of its informality so that it can conduct such activities outside the rubric, outside the banner, the official banner of the Quad. This is important for the Quad countries to do this, as long as what they're doing is actually building capability and not just doing it for the sake of sending a signal, right? Sending a signal is good and important for its own reasons. But I think what the Quad members understand is that they can pursue military cooperation outside the banner of the official Quad because that helps them to build that interoperability, build the mutual understanding and awareness of each other, of how each other works, without needing to formalize it, which would elicit the sort of fear response or negative reactions from across the region, which indirectly also gets to answering the first question, right, about how to ameliorate ASEAN's concerns. Part of ameliorating ASEAN's concerns is to keep these more provocative activities outside or uninstitutionalized from the official Quad. So I think the informality of it is a central attribute of minilaterals like the Quad.
So I think my co-panelists have done a great job on both of these questions. So I'll just make maybe like 2 quick points. The first is when I think about what makes networks or coalitions, minilaterals, whatever you want to call them, strong, it's not the formality. It's not the summit meeting between the leaders that makes a network or alliance or whatever strong. It's like all the layers of connections that form underneath. So I think NATO is a good example, right? Like we have meetings where all the heads of the NATO countries get together and, have big meeting at a place with a beautiful view, and you get the photos of them when they're doing their official meetings, and that's important. But what's really valuable about NATO, what makes it work, is the mill-to-mill connections, the economic connections, the defense industrial base ties, the political connections, diplomatic connections. Like that's where everything's happening, and we've seen that in the response to the war in Ukraine. Like that's where the weapons are flowing along these different lines, and they're trading between countries. And so the top level formality is important, but what really makes a network work is how deep and robust and vital those kind of underlying networks are. So, the informality of the Quad, I agree with what Arzan said, the way in which it facilitates them taking actions that would probably be impossible if it was formal. But I also see what really matters isn't the formality, it's what's happening underneath. And so that's what I'm always wanting to look at. And then in terms of, I don't really consider myself an expert on ASEAN, but to me, the functions of the Quad and ASEAN seem pretty distinct. I know there's overlap in the types of issues they deal with and the region in which they're operating. I do think though that they're filling gaps that exist. And so I think sort of focusing on what, again, going back to this idea of forming minilaterals around specific purposes and kind of narrow zooming in on what those purposes are, that they're the gaps that the Quad is trying to fill, rather than trying to take an approach where it's trying to where it's overlapping too much in how it frames its activities with ASEAN. And then I guess like the more, I don't know if it's realist or just cynical, it's like, you know, whichever organization is accomplishing what needs to be accomplished, like we shouldn't, like that should be where our focus is. And ASEAN, I think, gets caught up sometimes with the consensus building. I understand that that's important, but problems remain. So, you know, I think forge ahead.
As I mentioned, there were actually a few other questions that we don't have time to get to, but it clearly was a very stimulating and engaging conversation for our audience, and hopefully for our panelists here, some takeaway thoughts, maybe as Arzan noted, for areas for future study as well. So I want to thank all of our audience members for attending, and special thanks to our panelists for some great remarks and for sharing some of the findings from this roundtable. Again, quick plug, if you want to read the rest of the essays, it is available for download on NBR's website. It's available at nbr.org. So hope everybody has a great evening or morning, depending on where you're based. And thanks to you all.
I think we're off the air, guys.